Um, it's my pleasure tonight to welcome Professor Margaret Burnham. She's the University Distinguished Professor of Law at Northeastern University and the Director of the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project, from which this book, by hands now known, emerges. I'll give it a quick peek in case you haven't seen the cover. Part academic, part activist, Professor Burnham has had an interesting and distinguished career. She began her career with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. In 1977, she became the first African-American woman to serve in the Massachusetts judiciary. In 1993, President Nelson Mandela appointed her to serve on an International Human Rights Commission to investigate human rights violations there in South Africa. She has represented numerous civil rights and political activists in court. In 2021, President Joe Biden nominated her to serve as a member of the Civil Rights Cold Case Records Review Board. Civil Rights Cold Case Records Review Board. Long group name, right? Which is charged with reviewing civil rights era cases of murder and other racially motivated violence. I shared with Professor Burnham earlier, many titles come by our eyes as professors, and sometimes we should, but we don't always take a deeper look. There's so much good work going on. And I was aware of the book title. I'd heard some good things about it. And a few months after it came out, my next door neighbor, a man in his 80s, an avid general reader, came over, the book in hand, and he was just really interested in the book, so told me what a good book it was. And then he said, and you'll want to look at it because you're cited in a couple of the chapters. Well, I said, I'll have to look at the book. And I bought it, read it, and was fascinated, moved, and horrified, because there's a lot of stuff in the book to horrify us. Well, we're looking forward to hearing Professor Burnham's remarks about the book and the project that made it possible. And just a reminder that after the talk, there'll be an opportunity for Q&A. And so with that, I turn it over to Professor Margaret Burnham. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, and I greatly appreciate that generous introduction from Dean Jefferson Exum, as well as thank you so much, Roy. I think I have to thank both you and I as well. I have to thank your neighbor, because without his reading the book and recommending it to his next door neighbor, who happens to be a scholar, I guess I wouldn't be here in Detroit tonight. So I'm just really, really, really so thrilled to be here, and so thankful to all of the sponsors and co-sponsors who've made it possible for me to join you and talk to you here at the top of African American History Month, Black History Month. Back when I was a kid, it was Negro History Week, but that would date me, so I'm not going to tell you that story. But I'm so grateful to be here and talk again about the work that that resulted in this book. So let me just get right to it, and I'll tell you to sort of review the book a bit, and then we can certainly have some discussion. So the book is really a historical account of three interrelated themes. I'm looking at the experience of racial violence in the African American community in the mid-20th century. I'm also looking at the role of the federal government here, what the federal government did and didn't do to respond to this wave of violence that enforced Jim Crow. And then perhaps most importantly, I'm looking at the types and forms and spirit of resistance to this to this anchor of Jim Crow, which was in effect physical violence. So, there's a way in which the book speaks to today, because, of course, as we all know, we continue to grapple with police murders. We continue to grapple with, forms of violence that some have said are akin to old-fashioned lynchings. And we also continue to dispute what the federal role ought to be. And so, and as well, the forms of resistance to violence, racial violence, have continued to evolve over time. So certainly the links to today, the legacy, the dynamics of this project are prominent. But taken on its own terms, the book is really history. It's legal history and it's civil rights history, and it's intended to help us understand what life was like for those who lived it back in the mid 20th century, and to understand that on their terms, not on our terms, not through our lens, but what was their life like. So in that sense, it's particularly appropriate to talk about it this month, Black History Month. So why did I take up the topic? The stories are not well known, and the descendants are still alive. And so when, my partner and I, Professor Melissa Noble, she is a political scientist at MIT, began this work back in 2006 and 2007, we started calling the families many of whose stories are recounted in the book, but as well in more numerous ways in our archive, and they would inevitably say to us, "Why did it take so long to get this call?" So these are families who have experienced these things, and yet. And they experienced them at a time when law was unavailing. It was simply not available to them. And they are not people who are going to go out and hire lawyers to investigate what happened to their loved one in 1937 or 1947. And so unless someone decided to begin scraping away and unearthing and digging up the dirt and connecting the dots and digging down the ancestry, then with this history would remain buried. So it's that sort of just basic need to provide some counsel, legal and otherwise, to the families is one reason we took this project on. And the book is also obviously situated in scholarship. As Professor Roy has said, his work on the Underground Railroad, on the resistance communities that grew up around the Underground Railroad and that persisted after in the post-Reconstruction in the post-war period. All of that is relevant to the themes that I try to develop and build on in the book. Many years ago, two scholars by the name of Tolnay and Beck wrote a book called The Festival of Lynching. They're both sociologists, and they produced as well a database covering lynchings from 1877 to 1930. And their work spawned a whole series of books, some regional in nature, on the subject of lynching. They stopped their work in 1930, and that's where we picked up. And our view was that the period 1930, the pre-1930 period had pretty well been covered, had been tapped by scholars and community activists and others, and that they had well exploited and put to good use the work of Tolnay and Beck. But that the later period, 1930 to 1960, had not, and then obviously 1960, when you start with 1960, you're looking at the sort of traditional civil rights movement, and that work that period has also been written. But it was this long civil rights movement, decades of the mid 20th century, that had been left really not fully tapped. And so Tolnay and Beck, of course, the work of Roy Finkenbein and others, in a scholar by the name of Kadada Williams, who's written a wonderful book called I Saw Death Coming, A History of Torture and Survival in the War Against Reconstruction. Matthew Delmont has just written a book that came out last year called Half Americans, African Americans Fighting World War II at Home and Abroad. So I see our work as of a piece with that broader quilt that is being built by scholars across the disciplines, law, history, sociology, to political science, to reconstruct these reconstruct and make sense of these earlier years. And our work, as does the work of other scholars, presents new material on the pervasiveness, the ordinariness, the quotidian nature of the violence during this period. So let me start by saying a little bit about the legal framework within which my work is situated. So laws designed to address racial violence date from the Reconstruction period. So that the central, the sort of anchor law that on the criminal side that addresses this area is a law called 18 U.S. Code. We call it today's 18 U.S. Code Section 242. That law, which criminalizes racial violence and when enacted by state actors, was adopted in 1866. 1866, folks, 1 year after the end of the Civil War. But it was spottily enforced in the immediate aftermath of Reconstruction. There were some cases, but they were few in number. And then it was left to lie fallow until 1939, 1940. The U.S. Justice Department in 1939 created a civil rights, what we now know as the Civil Rights Division. It was first called the Civil Rights Unit, and your very own Frank Murphy was the head of the unit. Started off as head of the unit until FDR tapped him to be on the Supreme Court. But he first began to take a close look. He and his colleagues in this unit in 1939 began to take a close look at Section 242 and to determine whether it could be. Now think about the timetable here, folks. The campaigns against lynching are, in the 1910s and the 1920s. There is no legislation on the books at that time. All there is 242. Right? And yet 242 was not availed by the Justice Department or by others who could have used it to tamp down on some of the violence that so characterized, reinforced, undergirded, and perpetuated Jim Crow. So you had the civil rights. So you had on the criminal side you had 242, and then on the civil side you have, of course, the Civil Rights Act of what we now know is 42 U.S. Code 1983, which is also on the civil side giving folks a civil right of action if they were subjected to racial violence, and that too is not taken advantage of, is allowed to gather dust really until the 1950s, 1960s. So in addition to the 242, you also had another statute, 241, which also criminalized racial violence when perpetuated by non-state actors if they were acting in the context of conspiracies. And that too was simply allowed to sit in the statute books, even though at the end of the war, it was clear to the radical Republicans in Congress that legislation was essential to protect the former slaves. So that's the legal framework. So you have this huge gap, and that's where my book steps. It steps into this gap where the federal government could have had the tools to, but did nothing to intervene in the violence. I start the book with the story of Ollie Hunter. Now, Ollie Hunter was a mature woman, and she lived in a town in in Georgia, small town in Georgia. And she, in 1944, entered a store and picked up a can of oil, which offended the young store owner, a young white man, uh, who words were passed between the visitor to the store, Ollie Hunter, and the storekeeper. And at the end of the back and forth, she put the can down, walked out of the door, out of the store, and was struck by an axe by the storekeeper, and she died on the sidewalk. Now, her death, her horrific death, was the subject of a letter written by a man to the NAACP in New York City. And he said he didn't know her name. All he knew was that an old African-American woman had been killed on the streets of this town by a young white store owner. We picked up the case based on that one item, the letter, which lay in the NAACP files in the Library of Congress. And we started digging, and we found out who she was, who her family members were, that the young store owner had been promptly sent off to the war, and that no action had ever been taken to vindicate her murder. And I tell the story in the book in the hope that, having now thrown that story out to the world, someone will come forward and say, oh, I remember that. Oh, I know the name of the perpetrator. Oh, this left a horrible mark on our town. And that, my dear friends, has yet to happen. Yet to hear anything further about Ollie Hunter. So the book begins really with Professor Finkelbein's work in some sense, because I begin with rendition. I talk about the ways in which the practices and habits of the pre-Civil War era carried over into the post-war period. That the relationship between communities in the South and those in the North, the collective resistance that characterized the abolition era, in which communities in the North provided sanctuary and hope for those in the South, that those links and connections became equally important, if not more so, as we moved into the 1910s, 1920s, as we moved into the Great Migration, as we moved into the era of warmer suns, when more and more powerfully politically effective communities in the North, in Detroit, Chicago, New York, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, were able to extend support and help to those in the South who were running from Southern justice. And I talk here about the role of the lawyers in these cases, because these were complex cases, and for the most part, they were taken on by African-American, newly formed professional communities in these northern cities, many of them who came up in the NAACP, who worked for the NAACP and other social justice, racial conscious organizations, and who took on these cases and had to learn fairly complicated legal systems, sometimes touching on international law. If, for example, fugitives moved from Mississippi, as they did from Mississippi to Detroit to Canada, right? So these lawyers had to become widely and well-versed in, and not only that, but they had to be very effective community organizers. So not only did they have to master the law, figure out whether they wanted a federal forum or state forum, whether they wanted to go to the governor or to a judge in order to argue these cases where folks were running south to north. But they also had to make links with those communities in the South and make partnerships with communities in the South from whom they needed evidence to show that were these fugitives returned to Southern locales, they would be subjected to lynching. And so, and I used Detroit as my venue of preference here. Why? Because Detroit was particularly active. I don't know whether more so than Chicago and New York, but it was particularly active in respect to the protection of fugitives. So the communities that were establishing themselves in Detroit, a little Birmingham, for example, or a little Auburn, or a little Mobile, where local folks would, from these larger towns and cities in the South, would come up and gather together and live close to one another, in walking distance within one another, where families and extended families would come up and build and renew communities. These links became essential to helping establish a body of law that was as rich and as important and as consequential to freedom fighting as was that established in the abolition period. And so I use Detroit and the working class dynamics in Detroit, the strength of the labor movement in Detroit. As I said, the deep professional ties that lawyers had to working class people and to their civic organizations, all of that made Detroit not only an attractive place for fugitives, but also an attractive legal community in which to fight these cases. And so I talk about a woman who comes to Detroit 1928 from Florida, Pensacola, Florida, where she's running from a federal prosecution, an unjust federal prosecution. I talk about a couple, a couple from Mississippi, the Ellises, Washington and his wife come to leave Mississippi, where they're facing a lynching in 1935, and by stint of their imagination, not necessarily hiding in coffin boxes, but almost, they finally reach Detroit. They finally reach Black Bottom. They build a new life for themselves. 4 years after their escape from Mississippi, they're able to reach out and get their 4 children and bring them up to Detroit. And then someone answers an ad in a magazine, detective magazine, seeking their return to Mississippi, where they would be put on trial for their lives. And that case is fought through the federal courts in Detroit by brilliant lawyers, and they are allowed to remain in Black Bottom, the Ellises. And they're, in some sense, they're captive there, because if they leave Detroit, if they leave Michigan and go to Illinois or Pennsylvania, they would again be subject to the extradition proceedings that might be initiated by the powers that were in Mississippi. And those powers included the governor, the sheriff, the legislator, all of whom were out to return the Ellises to Mississippi. And then finally, I tell the story of one Wilbert Smith. running away from the law in New Orleans, a case in which he claims he was mistakenly identified as a man who shot a police officer. He knows if he's returned to New Orleans that he won't make it to a courtroom, much less to a jury and perhaps an acquittal. And so he gets a job in the auto industry, working for one of the factories, until the New Orleans police come up and seek to extradite him. He's not as lucky as the other people whose cases I recount. And in fact, those two police officers who came for him from New Orleans are successful in getting the judge to the Detroit judge to release him to them. They drive back down to New Orleans. On the way, they pass through Shreveport. People who see him in Shreveport notice that Wilbur Smith is bound by his hands, handcuffs on his legs and on his arms. And yet, when he gets back to New Orleans, the police officers claim he attempted to shoot them. And before he can be booked, he is shot dead in New Orleans, making clear to everyone, every judge in a northern city who ever held a hearing in an extradition case, rendition is what they called it then, what awaited those who had escaped Southern justice. So the book is organized in somewhat chronological order. And after I recount the stories, these Detroit Southern stories, I then move to recount the experiences of soldiers who during World War II were forced to ride Jim Crow, whether they had experience with Jim Crow transportation in the cities from whence they came or not. And here's a story that gives me enormous pleasure to recount because of what has happened quite recently. It's the story of Booker Washington, who grew up in a small town in Virginia, but spent most of his adult life in Philadelphia. He's recruited to serve in the army, and he goes down to Camp Butner, which is right outside of Durham, North Carolina. It's a Saturday night, July 8th, 1944. Booker Spicely is wearing the uniform of his country, visiting an African-American neighborhood for a little R&R. He jumps back on a bus, seeking, it appears, to return to base in his uniform. He sits next to the last row in the bus. A few stops later, some white soldiers, also decked in the same uniform, get on board, and the driver tells Spicely, move to the back of the bus. Spicely says, why do I have to do that? We're wearing the same uniform. And the driver gets angry and angrier. Spicely, when his stop comes, sensed that maybe he said a word too many and seeks to apologize to the bus driver, but it's too late. The bus driver follows Spicely as he descends from the bus and shoots and kills him, leaving him to bleed nearly to death on a Durham street corner. The police do come, and they take Spicely to the nearest hospital. It's a white hospital. There they test him to see if he could pass an alcohol test. He did. But they don't treat him. It's a white hospital. They send him to the colored hospital And there, Booker Spicely dies. That story occupied a line or two in some very well hidden secondary literature until our student in 2015 picked up the case and investigated it and wrote a paper about the Booker Spicely case. By the way, let me also say, to round this up and to explain the federal nexus. As I said, Booker's a soldier. And the War Department did indeed send its investigators to Durham to investigate the death of Booker Spicely. They spent their time sniffing around the Black community in Durham to make, and the Black soldier, and sniffing around Black soldiers in Camp Butner to make sure there would be no protest on account of Booker Spicely's murder. That's what the War Department did. That was the War Department's response. In any event, a few years ago, a lawyer by the name of James Williams, who practiced in North Carolina, he was a leading capital lawyer, a death penalty lawyer, retired and decided he wanted to work in the law, but not in the courtroom anymore. And he picked up my student's essay, found it online, and the Booker Spicely case. And he has dedicated 2 years of his life to lifting up that case and ensuring that everyone in the state of North Carolina knows who Booker Spicely was, and that his name and his story are as well remembered as that of Rosa Parks. It was my great pleasure on December 1st of last year, 2023, to travel to Durham and to be present when 25 Spicely family members gathered on the street corner where Booker Spicely lay dying and unveil a monument, a marker commemorating the courage of Booker Spicely and damning the system that led to his death, and using for the first time in the state of North Carolina, mark my words, people, the first time a marker in the state of North Carolina has ever used the term Jim Crow, December 1, 2023. And the story goes further. The Duke Power Company, now Duke Energy, ran the bus companies. And my student reached out to them and told them Booker Spicely's blood was really still on that corporation's hands. But she was calling from Boston and she got no response. James Williams, on the other hand, along with his colleagues in North Carolina, has gotten Duke Energy to contribute $100,000 to the Booker Spicely campaign, to include that story in the teaching material of the secondary schools in North Carolina, and donated thousands of dollars to a veterans clinic at North Carolina Central Law School. So the name is out there. And just as Booker Spicely's name is out there and has opened up books that might otherwise be closed by those in North Carolina, so too do I hope that the names of people like Ollie Hunter will do the same thing in the towns that they came from. I go on in the book to talk about the perversion of law wrought by Jim Crow. And in particular here, I talk about the law of kidnapping and the way in which kidnapping was used during the Jim Crow era, was applied, excuse me, during the Jim Crow era only as a crime to which white people could be victimized. And here I remind you of Emmett Till and what happened to him when he was pulled from his uncle's home in Money, Mississippi. Can't remember the name of the county, but the county is now the county what do you call it, motto is something like a good place to raise a boy. Money, Mississippi. Those folks were not charged with kidnapping. The case that got me started on all of this involved a kidnapping. The case in 1964, when I was in Mississippi and knew nothing about the kidnapping, murder, and lynching of two other young men my age in 1964, living a few counties away from where I was. Their names were Charles Moore and Henry Hezekiah D., and they lived in Franklin County. And Henry D. had just been to Chicago, and he had a conked hairstyle. And he came back to Franklin County. And the Klan was looking for local residents whom they thought might join the civil rights movement. And Henry D. looked like a good target because his hair was straightened. And these two boys were hitchhiking on a road in Franklin County, Meadville, Franklin County, when the Klan picked them up, beat them, held them at a farm, went down and got the sheriff of the county to help them search some locations that D and Moore said they might find guns at. No guns were found, but these two young men remained on the farm. The sheriff went home and had his dinner. D and Moore were taken by the Klan across the river, Mississippi River, to Louisiana side of the river, dumped in the river. One had an engine block attached to him and the other a log. When they were found a couple of months later, Charles Moore had his draft card and his college identification in his pocket. Sounds like a kidnapping to me, but not to the FBI. The FBI investigated that case in 1964 and did nothing. And in my chapter on kidnapping, I recount time and time again the ways in which certain laws were rendered inapplicable. There was, in effect, a legal right to commit a legal wrong when it came to Black people. And I theorize that failure to enforce laws against kidnapping is a direct legacy of slavery. The mark of which was, if a white man, like those who knocked on Emmett Till's door, uncle's door, said, "Come with me," you went. That was the mark of slavery. You went. And so too was it true in 1954, and 1953 for Emmett Till, and 1964 for Charles Moore and Henry Hezekiah D., and for all those others whose stories I tell in this book. And I talk about police as purveyors, as particular purveyors of violence, not in the ways we see today, not exclusively in the ways we see, for example, in the George Floyd case, the Tyree Nichols case, but in the ways of the 1940s. And I talk about what the differences, not just the continuities, but as well the differences between policing in that time and this time. And then finally, and we can open it up for Q&A, our Supreme Court. Here, I talk about a case called U.S. versus Screws, well known to lawyers, not so well known, and here my effort is to introduce it to non-lawyers. A case in which a man is dragged out of his home because he insists on his right to own a gun by a sheriff and his deputies, dragged to the county courthouse in Georgia, again, another small town in Georgia, beaten to death on the county courthouse lawn, leaving the neighbors, those of you who know county courthouses in the north, in the south, know that they're surrounded oftentimes by big houses. And you know that in the summertime, those windows are open. And the neighbors looked out and heard the whipping, which went on and on and on until Mr. Hall was dead. Robert Hall was dead. In that case, the sheriff, Sheriff Screws, was indeed finally prosecuted by the federal government and was indeed convicted. That case gets up to the Supreme Court. The charge is that Sheriff Screws, a state actor, had violated Statute 242, 18 U.S. Code 242, and should be punished for it. And the Supreme Court goes through obscene machinations to release Screws and thereby forever loosen any value that 18 U.S. Code 242 could have in the fight against racial violence. It's not just a recounting of the Supreme Court's role here, but it's also, again, lifting up the efforts of Charles Hamilton Houston, Thurgood Marshall, and scores of other lawyers to persuade the court that our federal judicial system would not be worth the paper the Constitution is written on if Southern legal authorities were allowed to dismiss its words and, in fact, enact their own forms of authoritarianism. And I make the point in the book that we here in our country talk about authoritarian governments all over the world without fully realizing that we need only look at our own country in the last century to understand what it means to live in a state, whether it's capital S or small s, where you cannot go down to the county courthouse and knock on the door and say, I want to talk to my counselor, my city counselor, or the deputy sheriff who comes from my neighborhood, because there is none. You don't vote. And you have nobody you can talk to. When the family members of Dee and Moore in 1964 went to the courthouse in Meadville, Mississippi, Franklin County, and said, "Where are our boys?" The sheriff, who knew well that they had been lynched, said, "We don't know. Just wait a few days, they'll be back." And there was no one those mothers could turn to because they could not vote. And so one thing fed the other. The violence fed the disfranchisement fed the violence. And that's what authoritarianism is all about. Finally, the book is about repair, the work that confronts us all today, my good people. And that's the story of Booker Spiceley. And here I want to end with one other story before we open up to Q&A. And it's a wartime story as well. It's the story of a man in Algiers. I know the dean knows something about this because that's her hometown. A man in Algiers, Louisiana. Algiers, good folks, is right across it's in New Orleans Parish, right across the street from New Orleans. And this is the story of a man named Albert Williams, who was walking to church on a Wednesday with his wife and his 2 children. They had 4. They left 2 of the children, 2 of the boys at home. Mrs. Williams has a babe in arms, and the other boy is walking next to his dad. And there was a viaduct way back then that carried pedestrians across into Algiers from New Orleans. And there are a bunch of sailors on that viaduct. All the bad stuff that you didn't want to happen in New Orleans, you threw it across the way to Algiers, including the US bases. There was a military base there, Marines. And these 2 Marines had just come from New Orleans, and they threw beer down on Mr. Williams and his wife. And having doused the wife with beer, Mr. Williams looked up at them and he asked them why they treated his wife that way. And the boys started with the N-word and the this and the that. And they came down from the viaduct. And in their hand, they had their beer bottles, which they then broke and stabbed Mr. Williams to death right there on the street between his house and his church. So we picked up this story, and I asked a student of mine to begin to investigate it. The first thing she did was to try to find a man by the name of Alvin Williams in New Orleans. And she couldn't find him. She couldn't find, or to find, excuse me, the son. And she finally found the son who was in his mother's arms in 1941, 42. And he is the minister, or was at that point the minister, of the beautiful Zion Baptist Church in Algiers, the very church his father and mother were going to on the night his father was killed. And my student called the minister and asked to talk to him about the case. And he said to her, have you lived the life I've lived? Do you know anything? about Black violence, she had to say no. And he couldn't talk about it anymore. And he hadn't talked about it. And I told her she had to persist and find the family members with whom she could share all she had found out about the case. Most importantly, that indeed there had been a trial of these two sailors. Indeed, they had been acquitted in a New Orleans County courthouse, in a New Orleans Parish courthouse. Indeed, immediately after their acquittal, they were sent abroad to fight for democracy in Paris, France. And I told her she needed to share that. And so she kept calling the Williams family until she reached a young woman by the name of Jonique, who would have been the grandfather of Edwin Williams, the dead man. And Jonique worked with her and Jonique's brothers and sisters to return this story to the family. And on Father's Day, 2 years ago, all of the Williams brothers, all of whom are still alive, all 4 of them, their mother is dead, gathered with all of their family members at the beautiful Zion Baptist Church in Algiers and commemorated the life of Edwin Williams. His story is now in the museum, World War II museum. There is now a plaque that tells his story, and it too will become as well known. There's an effort to name a street in Algiers after Edwin Williams, and it too will become as well known as that of Booker Spiceley. And that's the repair work. And it's not enough, but it is something. Thank you very much.